By November 1944, the Western Front carried a quiet that felt earned but uneasy, a thinning of sound along forest roads and frost-stiffened fields where men learned to listen for what was not being said. In the Ardennes, the land itself seemed to withdraw. Villages dimmed early, tree lines closed ranks, and the weather pressed down with a damp cold that deadened engines and slowed the step. Reports moved through Allied channels in fragments. Unusual rail traffic east of the Rhine, divisions absent from expected sectors, a tightening of German radio discipline that left more silence than chatter. It was not proof, only pressure, the kind that accumulates before a storm. To commanders who had learned the language of maneuver and counterstroke, the signs carried a weight that could not be measured on a map alone. Jacob L. Devers read those signs with the eye of a man shaped by movement. He had commanded in fluid battles where speed punished hesitation, and he understood how a force could be assembled under cover of winter, shielded by terrain and weather that Allied air power could not yet master. His formations were strong, his staff practiced in rapid shifts of weight, and his view of the front was not a line but a system that could be bent without breaking. Devers argued that a deliberate realignment, shortening sectors, deepening reserves, tightening command response, could deny the enemy the space and time required for a gamble. He did not ask for panic or spectacle. He asked for readiness sharpened into posture. The Ardennes, he believed, was not quiet by chance. It was quiet because something was being held back. The argument traveled upward into a command structure that had learned, through years of coalition war, that decisions were never only tactical. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at the center of that structure, burdened with a front that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and an alliance that required constant balance. British and American forces were interlocked not just in the field, but in trust, and every adjustment carried implications beyond the immediate ground. Supply lines were strained by distance and weather, ports still clawing their way back to full capacity, roads breaking under the weight of traffic and frost, fuel, ammunition, replacements. Each had its own arithmetic, and that arithmetic resisted sudden change. Eisenhower listened to intelligence officers who cautioned against reading intent, where the enemy might simply be conserving strength. He listened to commanders who feared that pulling forces inward would signal weakness or disrupt hard-won momentum. Winter compounded the dilemma. The Ardennes was poor country for movement once snow settled in. Its narrow roads and heavy forests hostile to massed armor and quick reinforcement. Allied planners had long considered it unsuitable for a major offensive, and that assumption had shaped deployments that favored sectors where pressure was expected. To alter that judgment meant not only shifting divisions, but revising a shared understanding of the front, an understanding that had held through months of advance. Eisenhower weighed Devers's urgency against the need to maintain cohesion among commanders whose confidence was itself a weapon. He knew that aggressive realignment could blunt a blow that might never come, but it could also fray relationships and expose other sectors if the enemy chose differently. Signals continued to arrive, incomplete but persistent. Prisoner interrogations hinted at units resting deeper than usual. Reconnaissance flights, when weather allowed, returned photographs that raised questions rather than settled them. The German army, battered and short of fuel, was still capable of concealment, and concealment was itself a form of intent. Eisenhower's response remained measured. He authorized vigilance, reinforced intelligence collection, and emphasized flexibility without committing to the sweeping shifts Devers proposed. The front would hold, he believed, because it had held before, and because the alliance that sustained it required steadiness as much as foresight. In the end, the decision was not a rejection of danger, but a judgment about risk, made under conditions where certainty was unavailable and the cost of error ran in both directions. Devers continued to prepare within his command, refining plans that could be enacted quickly if the signs sharpened into action. Eisenhower maintained the balance of a coalition at war, preserving the structures that allowed millions of men to move and fight as one. The Ardennes remained quiet, the forests darkening under early winter skies, while Allied command lived with the knowledge that silence could be a warning, and that caution, too, carried its own price. The idea took shape in the quiet spaces between reports, where maps lay creased from constant handling, and the smell of damp wool clung to command rooms from the men who came and went. Jacob L. Devers did not argue from theory. His thinking was forged in motion, in the hours when columns moved at night without lights and decisions were measured in miles gained before dawn. Speed, to him, was not recklessness, but control. The ability to arrive before an enemy plan could settle into coherence. By late 1944, as winter tightened its grip on the European theater, Devers saw danger not in overextension, but in stillness. A front that appeared calm, he believed, was a front offering space for an adversary to assemble, conceal, and strike. As commander of the 6th Army Group, Devers oversaw formations that had learned to move under pressure. His soldiers had crossed rivers under fire, driven through broken terrain, and forced decisions upon enemy commanders who had hoped for time they were never given. In southern France, momentum had been created not by overwhelming numbers alone, but by the careful concentration of force at decisive points, followed by relentless movement that denied the enemy the chance to regroup. Devers carried those lessons north with him. He understood how quickly operational balance could shift when armored units were repositioned with intent, how a tightened front reduced vulnerability by shortening response times and clarifying command responsibility. To him, armored reserves were not symbols of reassurance parked deep in the rear, but tools meant to be felt along the line. The Ardennes, with its narrow roads and dense forests, was often dismissed as unsuitable for large-scale maneuver. Yet Devers saw in that judgment a hidden risk. Terrain that restricted movement also magnified surprise. And winter weather that grounded aircraft gave greater value to what could be moved on the ground. His proposal called for drawing strength inward, shifting armored units closer to threatened sectors, and removing the slack that allowed an enemy to penetrate before resistance could form. This was not an abandonment of ground, but a refinement of posture, trading breadth for depth. He believed that denying operational space would force any German thrust to reveal itself early, while it was still fragile, before momentum and morale could build. Devers's confidence rested on experience paid for in lives and steel. In France, he had seen how hesitation invited recovery, how pauses, however brief, gave the enemy time to repair bridges, reconstitute shattered units, and restore command. In southern Europe, where terrain was unforgiving and supply lines stretched thin, decisive movement had often been the difference between a controlled advance and a costly stalemate. He had watched enemy formations collapse not because they were annihilated, but because they were unbalanced, struck before their intentions hardened into action. These memories shaped his sense of urgency. He did not assume German weakness. He assumed German calculation, and he respected it enough to plan against it. Within his headquarters, the proposal was discussed in practical terms. Staff officers traced routes on maps, calculated fuel consumption in winter conditions, and examined road nets that could bear the weight of armor without collapsing under frost and traffic. They considered how quickly units could be redeployed, how command lines would shorten, how communication might improve when fewer gaps separated formations. Devers pressed for readiness that could be executed without delay, for plans that required decision rather than permission, once the first signs appeared. To him, preparation was itself an act of deterrence, reducing the enemy's options before they were exercised. The strength of his argument lay not in alarm, but in economy. He did not ask for more divisions or grand offensives, only for a redistribution of what already existed, aligned with the realities of winter warfare. He understood the strain on supply and the fatigue of men who had been advancing for months. Yet he believed that controlled movement now would spare greater exhaustion later. A tightened front, he argued, would mean fewer emergency marches, fewer frantic counterattacks launched in darkness and confusion. It would replace reaction with position. When Devers pressed his case, it was with the calm assurance of a commander who had seen plans succeed because they were timely, not because they were perfect. He spoke of denying the enemy choices, of shaping the battlefield before it demanded shaping under fire. In his view, speed and concentration were not aggressive gestures, but protective ones, methods of ensuring that when the enemy acted, he would do so against prepared ground and ready forces. As winter settled over the forests and valleys, Devers continued to refine his thinking, convinced that momentum, once lost, was far harder to regain than it was to preserve. Hesitation in the winter of 1944 did not come easily to a man accustomed to making decisions that moved continents of men and machines. Yet at Supreme Headquarters, the maps told stories that could not be read from a single sector alone. Dwight D. Eisenhower carried the weight of a front that stretched across Europe, held together not only by divisions and depots, but by agreements forged among allies whose trust was hard-won and easily strained. Each pin on the map represented more than terrain. It marked a promise that ground would be held, that commitments made in conference rooms and cables would not be undone by sudden shifts born of anxiety rather than necessity. The war Eisenhower directed was a coalition war in its purest form. British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces were interdependent, their plans braided together by months of negotiation and compromise. Any major redeployment reverberated beyond the immediate tactical gain. To thin one sector meant explaining to another commander why his frontage had grown longer, his reserves thinner, his margin for error narrower. Supply lines, already stretched by distance and winter weather, were calibrated to existing deployments. Fuel convoys moved on schedules that assumed stability. Ammunition dumps were stocked according to forecasts that could not be rewritten overnight, and replacement flows followed paths laid weeks in advance. Eisenhower understood that momentum was sustained not only by boldness, but by the quiet reliability of systems that worked because they were not constantly disturbed. What troubled him most was the arithmetic of exposure. The front, on paper, contained quiet stretches that owed their calm to geography, recent fighting, or simple exhaustion on both sides. To weaken those sectors in order to strengthen another meant gambling that the enemy shared Allied assumptions about where action was likely or profitable. Eisenhower had seen before how assumptions hardened into blind spots. In North Africa and Italy, misjudgments about enemy intent had carried costs measured in days lost and lives taken. He did not dismiss warnings. He weighed them against the risk of creating a new vulnerability, one born not of enemy cunning, but of Allied choice. Within his headquarters, the debate unfolded without drama. Intelligence officers laid out assessments that spoke in probabilities rather than certainties. Logistics staff outlined what could be moved quickly and what could not, what would arrive late and what might not arrive at all if roads iced over or bridges failed under load. Eisenhower listened, absorbing the tension between foresight and overreaction. He knew that committing fully to a sweeping realignment would signal confidence in a particular reading of German intent. If that reading proved incomplete, the cost would be borne elsewhere along the line, perhaps in sectors whose quiet masked only temporary weakness. There was also the human dimension, less visible on maps, but no less real. Commanders in the field had learned to trust the ground beneath them, to understand their neighbors and the rhythm of reliefs and resupply. Sudden changes unsettled that understanding. Eisenhower feared the erosion of confidence that came when units felt exposed, not by enemy action, but by decisions made far to the rear. In winter conditions, when morale was already tested by cold, fatigue, and separation from home, he was reluctant to impose additional strain without unmistakable cause. Eisenhower's caution was shaped by memory as much as by calculation. He remembered earlier phases of the war when impatience had collided with reality, when ambitious movements had outrun supply or fractured unity. The lesson he carried was not that boldness failed, but that boldness divorced from balance could unravel gains as quickly as it achieved them. He sought to preserve a front that could absorb shocks from multiple directions, trusting flexibility within existing structures rather than a dramatic reshaping that might satisfy one concern while sowing another. As days shortened and weather reports grew more pessimistic, Eisenhower held to a posture of watchfulness. He reinforced intelligence efforts, urged commanders to maintain readiness, and emphasized the importance of local initiative within established boundaries. He did not deny the possibility of danger. He refused only to allow that possibility to dictate a course that might fracture the cohesion upon which Allied strength depended. His responsibility was not to one proposal or one sector, but to the integrity of the entire front and the alliance that sustained it. In that restraint lay a difficult acceptance. That command at the highest level often meant choosing between imperfect options, none of which offered certainty. Eisenhower's hesitation was not indecision, but a deliberate pause, an effort to ensure that in guarding against one threat, he did not invite another. As winter settled across Europe, he continued to balance warning against stability, mindful that the war he directed could be lost as easily through internal dislocation as through enemy action. The morning broke without warning in the Ardennes, a gray December dawn where sound carried poorly through fog and snow-laden trees. In the thinly held sectors along the Schnee-Eifel and the Our River, infantrymen woke to a concussion that seemed to lift the forest floor itself. Artillery fire rolled through the valleys, muffled and relentless, followed by the grinding approach of armor moving along roads believed impassable in winter. Telephone lines went dead, radios crackled with fragments, and runners pushed forward through falling snow to find companies already under pressure. What had been quiet became suddenly crowded with urgency. The stillness replaced by the unmistakable rhythm of an attack launched with intent. German forces struck where the front was stretched, their columns exploiting gaps that existed not on maps, but in the lived reality of dispersed units and limited reserves. In villages like Losheim and Hosingen, small American detachments fought from cellars and roadblocks, delaying as best they could, while the weight of the offensive gathered behind them. Tanks appeared on narrow roads at angles no one expected, engines roaring in the cold air, their silhouettes emerging from mist that swallowed distances. The ground favored surprise, the forests masking movement, the weather grounding aircraft that might have broken up the advance before it found momentum. The cost of reaction revealed itself hour by hour. Allied commanders scrambled to understand the scale of the assault, piecing together reports that arrived late and incomplete. Units were ordered to move under fire, often at night, through snow-choked roads that turned columns into targets and slowed reinforcement to a crawl. Men marched without sleep, boots freezing stiff, weapons fouled by ice and mud. Civilians fled along the same roads, carts and wagons mingling with military traffic, the human tide adding confusion to an already strained system. The struggle became one of containment, of buying time with lives while a coherent response was assembled. As the Germans drove deeper, the arithmetic of thin lines became merciless. Isolated battalions were encircled, their resistance measured in hours that mattered far beyond their immediate ground. The soundscape of the forest changed, sporadic rifle fire replaced by the deeper note of tank guns, the air filled with the crack of exploding trees, and the metallic echo of shells striking frozen earth. Medics worked in barns and improvised aid stations, hands numb, breath visible as they moved from one wounded man to the next. The front bent under pressure, not from collapse of will, but from the simple fact that there had been little depth to absorb the blow. Weeks followed in which the struggle hardened into endurance. Reinforcements arrived, but at cost, pulled from other sectors and rushed forward into conditions few had anticipated. The effort to stabilize the line demanded continuous movement, counterattacks launched with limited preparation, positions retaken and lost again. The weather as much an adversary as the enemy. Thousands fell in the process, the tally growing not in dramatic surges, but in steady accumulation, each mile contested exacting its price. What had begun as surprise settled into a grinding contest that consumed time as surely as it consumed men and material. Among senior commanders, reflection accompanied action. There was recognition that warning signs had existed, that arguments for denying space and tightening posture had been voiced with urgency before the first guns spoke. The question did not present itself as accusation but as inquiry, an effort to understand how surprise had achieved such effect against forces that were strong in number and experience. The answer lay partly in the nature of coalition warfare and partly in the unforgiving logic of winter terrain, where assumptions hardened and movement became costly. The offensive demonstrated how quickly initiative could shift when space was granted and reaction replaced position. As the fighting wore on and the line gradually steadied, the forests bore the marks of what had passed through them: burned-out vehicles, shattered villages, fields churned into frozen mud. Soldiers who survived carried forward an understanding paid for in exhaustion and loss, that quiet could be deceptive, that reserves mattered most where movement was hardest, and that the margin between readiness and reaction could be measured in lives. The Ardennes offensive made its lessons plain without commentary, inscribed in ground taken and retaken, and in the weeks of hard fighting required to contain a blow that had arrived unannounced. In the quiet that followed the heaviest fighting, when staffs returned to maps now crowded with new scars, a different kind of reckoning took place. It did not unfold in public statements or official communiques, but in the subdued language of professionals weighing decisions made under pressure. At the highest levels of Allied command, the war had always demanded more than instinct. It required restraint imposed upon urgency, and the discipline to measure what could be gained against what might be lost beyond the immediate horizon. The Ardennes had exposed that tension with unusual clarity, laying bare the distance between how battles were sensed by those close to the ground and how wars were held together at the top. Dwight D. Eisenhower's approach had been shaped by the burden of coordination. His authority rested not on unilateral power, but on consent sustained across nations with distinct histories, priorities, and fears. Unity was not an abstract virtue. It was a daily requirement that determined whether armies moved as one or fractured under strain. Stability along the front meant predictability for logistics, confidence for commanders, and reassurance for allies who watched each adjustment for signs of imbalance. Control in this sense was not rigidity, but a framework that allowed millions of men to fight without dissolving into confusion. Eisenhower's decisions reflected a belief that preserving that framework was itself a form of strength, even when it constrained the freedom to act on instinct. Opposite that restraint stood the operational mindset embodied by Jacob L. Devers, a commander whose experience had taught him that momentum was fragile, and that initiative, once surrendered, was costly to reclaim. His instincts were grounded in movement, in the conviction that space granted to an enemy became opportunity, and that concentration of force could preempt danger before it matured. Devers's perspective was not reckless. It was shaped by campaigns where speed and decisiveness had prevented prolonged suffering. Yet at the level Eisenhower occupied, instinct competed with obligations that extended far beyond a single sector or proposal. The clash between these perspectives was not personal, nor was it a contest of right and wrong. It was the natural friction of command at scale, where clarity diminishes as responsibility expands. Eisenhower could not act solely as a battlefield commander. He was the steward of an alliance whose cohesion had to survive setbacks and successes alike. A calculated risk taken in one place risked cascading effects elsewhere, political repercussions, logistical strain, or the erosion of trust among partners whose cooperation was essential to ultimate victory. To choose restraint was to accept vulnerability in the short term in exchange for continuity in the long term, a trade that could only be judged imperfectly while events were still unfolding. Devers, in this equation, became a figure associated with possibility. His foresight, sharpened by experience, suggested alternatives that might have altered the immediate course of events. Yet the weight of command did not rest on foresight alone. It rested on the capacity to absorb uncertainty without allowing it to fracture the whole. History, viewed from a distance, often isolates moments and measures them against outcomes. For those making decisions in real time, outcomes were unknowable. And the margin for error was defined not by one consequence, but by many. The Ardennes did not resolve this tension. It illuminated it. The episode demonstrated how even the most perceptive warnings could be tempered by responsibilities that lay outside the realm of maneuver warfare. It showed that high command was less about choosing the best option in isolation than about choosing the least destabilizing option within a fragile system. Eisenhower's leadership preserved that system, ensuring that the alliance endured the shock and continued to function as a unified force. In doing so, it revealed the cost inherent in restraint, just as Devers's arguments revealed the cost inherent in caution, untempered by action. In the end, the story rests not on individual vindication, but on the complexity of command itself. War at the highest level demanded decisions and that no amount of experience could simplify. Choices made where every path carried risk, and every delay had consequence. Devers stands as an example of how sharp operational insight can challenge prevailing assumptions, while Eisenhower stands as a reminder that foresight alone does not command armies. Structures do, alliances do, and the steady maintenance of control often determines whether those armies can continue to fight. Between them lies the enduring reality of high command, where even the clearest vision must contend with the immense weight of responsibility that governs the conduct of war. Decisions made far from the front lines shaped what could be done when events moved faster than plans. Leadership in this sense was not merely the exercise of power, but the management of trust in structures, in personalities, and in judgments formed under pressure. Eisenhower's choice to limit Jacob Devers' influence reflected this tension. It was a decision rooted in responsibility rather than fear, in the belief that unity was the foundation upon which all Allied strength rested. The coalition was not an abstract concept, but a living system of men, nations, and expectations. To disrupt it carried risks that could not be measured solely in divisions or miles gained. Eisenhower understood that authority, once fractured, invited confusion that no amount of battlefield brilliance could easily repair. Yet war rarely offers perfect choices. Every safeguard imposes its own cost. By prioritizing cohesion, Eisenhower accepted limits on adaptability, trusting that established commanders and systems would respond adequately to whatever emerged. Devers represented an alternative kind of leadership, one attuned to disruption, to rapid reassessment, to acting before certainty hardened. Empowering such a figure might have sharpened responsiveness, but it also threatened to unsettle relationships already strained by months of campaigning. This episode reveals the quiet burden borne by commanders at the highest level. They operate in a space where military logic intersects with human emotion and political reality. Decisions must account not only for what might succeed, but for what others are prepared to accept. The willingness to empower a strong, independent mind carries the risk of internal friction, of disagreement made visible at moments when unity appears essential. Avoiding that risk can preserve harmony, but it can also narrow the range of possible responses when conditions change abruptly. On the ground, soldiers rarely see these calculations. They experience their consequences instead, through orders that arrive late or early, through reinforcements that appear or do not, through the sense that higher headquarters either anticipated events or was caught reacting to them. Leadership at the top sets the tone long before the first shot is fired, shaping whether forces are positioned to absorb shock or merely to hold ground. The absence of Devers's influence did not negate Allied competence or courage. Units fought with determination, adapting under fire, drawing on discipline forged over years of war. But the episode underscores a deeper truth, that preventing catastrophe is often less about accumulating strength than about aligning judgment with opportunity. Numbers and resources matter, but they are inert without minds willing to challenge assumptions and act decisively when patterns shift. Empowering such minds is never simple. It demands tolerance for dissent, patience with friction, and confidence that disagreement need not signal disloyalty. In wartime, where stakes are measured in lives and nations, these qualities are difficult to sustain. Leaders must decide when stability serves them best and when it becomes a liability. The balance is delicate, and misjudging it can leave armies strong yet unprepared. In reflecting on Eisenhower's decision, the lesson lies not in assigning fault, but in understanding the nature of command under coalition warfare. Leadership requires choosing which risks to accept and which to avoid, knowing that no choice is without consequence. The strength of an army rests not only in its firepower, but in its capacity to recognize when established methods no longer fit emerging realities. The winter of 1944 exposed how easily success can foster certainty, and how certainty can limit imagination. It also showed that leadership is as much about who is allowed to shape decisions as it is about who issues orders. Empowering the right minds at the right moment may invite tension, but denying that opportunity can leave forces reacting rather than anticipating. In the end, the episode stands as a reminder that war tests judgment as relentlessly as it tests endurance. Preventing disaster is rarely the result of a single brilliant act. It is the outcome of countless decisions, each weighing unity against initiative, order against adaptability. In that balance, the fate of campaigns often turns quietly before the world notices.